Police departments across the country are receiving evaluations for their response to the protests following George Floyd's death. Protesters gathered to demand police reform and racial equity last summer. Many were met with a violent response from police officers, including the use of tear gas and pepper spray. At least 8 protesters went blind after being allegedly attacked by officers. Most of the country watched the violence unfold on television and on social media. New independent reports revealed just how unprepared police departments were during these mass protests. From minimal training to limited intelligence reports, many departments failed to de-escalate tense situations. Joining me now to discuss is Kim Barker. Kim is an enterprise reporter for the New York Times. Kim, welcome. Great to have you with us. So, what were some of the most common problems highlighted across all of the reports you analyzed for this investigation?
Well, we looked at more than a dozen reports, and 9 of those reports were done by external organizations like offices of inspector generals and attorney generals and Justice Department investigators, looking at the response of police to these protests. About 6 of those reports were done internally. And overwhelmingly, what you found, especially in the outside reports, is the fact that police did not have enough training. They did not have enough planning for these protests. Even after the protests initially started in Minneapolis, departments such as in Chicago or in Los Angeles thought that those protests wouldn't come their way. And you have to ask yourself, after 10 years of protests that have spread nationally, why police departments didn't plan better and why officers in those departments weren't trained to deal with things like mass arrests and crowd control, especially differentiating between controlling crowds and allowing crowds to express their First Amendment rights to protest. And I think this was made even more tense because people were protesting the very sorts of brutality that in some cases was happening, right? They were protesting police. And I think that added to the level of tension that was happening.
Now, we see these images, like the image we're looking at right now, of police officers in almost full-on army gear, as if they're, going into war, really. And this has been the case, though, for decades. Why, after all of this time, have police departments not updated their protocols for responding to protests? And why do departments fail to train their officers when they do update these protocols?
I mean, you raise a really good point. Between 1967 and 1976, there were 3 specially appointed presidential commissions that were looking at this very idea of, police showing up, being over-militarized and wearing what's been termed as riot gear, and how this has the exact opposite influence on protesters that police would want it to have. They want to de-escalate this sort of level of conflict, and turning up in riot gear before anything is necessarily happening tends to escalate tensions. And I think that's natural. People can understand that. So these 3 commissions have found that between 67 and 76. And then, in fact, in 2015, and looking to the fallout from the Ferguson protests, they found the same thing. They found that the whole idea that police should look for a guardian type of mentality versus a warrior type of mentality. And, in report after report, that's what they were finding nationally, is that police were showing up in riot gear and escalating things instead of de-escalating things. And, there is this argument to be made, what happens if a protest turns violent? You can't have police just there wearing their normal uniforms. That could put police in danger, because some of these protests did turn, violent, and there was looting, and there were police that were under attack. But the argument is that maybe there should be, police officers who are ready, waiting in riot gear, ready in case things start to go wrong in a staging area that's nearby, as opposed to being out there on the front lines from the very beginning. The whole goal here is to how do you let people protest and exercise their First Amendment rights without escalating that and without letting them turn violent.
Right. So another wave of law enforcement response, perhaps, that is waiting in the wings. That's a very good idea. I like that you highlight the difference between the police officers being warriors or guardians, and how are they perceived by the community and by the protesters. So when you looked at all of these reports, who in the end should be held accountable for the sort of nationwide failure of the police departments in light of all of this?
I mean, I think that that's a really good question. We have individual police departments in different cities, and we don't even yet have the report out of Minneapolis. In fact, that was only commissioned last month. And despite months of pressure from advocates who wanted there to be some sort of after-action report in Minneapolis, so we don't even really know what the full picture is yet, especially since these protests started in Minneapolis. You have to hold police departments accountable. And I know that a lot of police departments are going to say, well, we don't have the money to do the kind of training that's being called for. We didn't have the time to do the kind of planning that was necessary because this was like a once in a lifetime experience, but it's really not. I mean, there have been these protests that have happened over the last decade. Anytime a Black person is killed at the hands of police, like these protests have started spreading, and people are angry and people want to have some sort of voice in what's happening with policing. And you just have to wonder what's going to happen in the future if Derek Chauvin, who is the officer accused in George Floyd's death, if he is not convicted of the most serious charge, and his trial is now underway, and whether police are planning in that eventuality.
Right. That is a very, very good point. Kim Barker, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate your insight.
Thanks very much.